So let me begin then by introducing our first speaker, who is Randolph Nesse. Randy Nesse is Professor of Psychiatry and Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan, where he directs the Evolution and Human Adaptation program. He collaborated with George Williams to write several seminal works on Darwinian medicine, including Why We Get Sick, the New Science of Darwinian Medicine. His early research on the neuroendocrinology of anxiety has been transformed into a focus on how selection shapes mechanisms and regulate defenses such as pain, fever, anxiety, and low mood. He is devoted to encouraging doctors and researchers to apply evolutionary insights in diverse areas of medicine and to helping organize the growing evolution and medicine community via evolutionandmedicine.org. Despite years of training as a psychiatrist, he admits that he found it very hard and counterintuitive to train his dog, Lucy. Randy.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's wonderful to be with you here this morning. I'd like to begin by emphasizing that the task I undertake this morning is, in fact, not possible. I'm going to try to talk about how evolution is useful for medicine. Keep in mind that this is very much like talking about how physics is useful for engineering. One can skim the surface of it in two different ways, by saying generalities, which would be banal, or by specifics that you can't justify adequately. I'm going to do a little bit of both. I'd like first, however, to note a follow-up on Janet Brown's wonderful talk last night and a question that was asked. Someone said, so where indeed would Darwin fit at Cambridge today? She did her best to answer this question and said probably, certainly he'd be in biology. I think not. Actually, I think Darwin would not, in fact, be eligible for a position at Cambridge today. And the evidence for this I have is the many, many young people who write me saying, I want to study evolutionary applications in medicine. Where can I go? And the answer is nowhere, not yet. There are a few programs beginning, but it's astounding that this is a gap in the academic, in the academy. It's fallen between the cracks, and I think because it's not all that specific, it's trying to apply a broad theory to a large area, and this kind of generality does not find a welcome home in the academy. We begin with Darwinian medicine, beginning, of course, with Darwin. And in fact, Darwin devoted an entire book to Darwinian medicine back in 1794. The purport to the following pages is an endeavor to reduce the facts belonging to animal life into classes, order, genre, and species, and by comparing them with each other to unravel the theory of diseases. Now, of course, there is a problem here, isn't there? 1794 is somewhat before our 200th anniversary. Darwin was not even a twinkle in Emma's eye at that time. Of course, this is Erasmus Darwin. And interestingly, this is the very opening paragraph of the spectacular poem Zoonomia by Darwin's grandfather Erasmus. So we begin with Erasmus Darwin, whose family motto, in fact, was E conscius omnia, everything from shells. He believed everything came from shells, and in fact, the vicar of Lichfield said, you may not have that on your coach. I'll see to it you don't get any patients. So he painted out his motto on his coach, the very first doctor to have to limit his science for the sake of his practice. So we come to the family dynasty, first of all, with Erasmus, a well-successful, grand intellect and well-fed man. His father also was significantly robust and successful in his practice. And then we come to the third generation. You know, bad things happen to the third generation. Robert, in fact, of course, was a medical school dropout. Thank goodness. I'd like to emphasize another Cambridge graduate, class of 1763, for his contributions to evolutionary medicine. People talk these days about Paley and his nonsense about the watch, and because the intelligent designers use him. But have you read Paley? Paley was brilliant, and his book, I think, is one of the masterpieces of his century. In fact, it was not required reading at Cambridge. His moral philosophy was the established canon for moral teaching, but natural theology was not. The students read it just because it was all the rage. Published in 1802, it was in its 12th edition by the time Darwin was born. And here's what Darwin says about his Cambridge education. The logic of Paley's evidences of Christianity and, as I may add, of his natural theology gave me as much delight as Euclid. The careful study of these works was the only part of the academical course, which was of the least use to me in the education of my mind. I would encourage everyone who's engaged with intelligent design types to read Paley. This is what we all would have been like before Charles Darwin, trying to interpret the mysteries of the body. Darwin, of course, gave us this wonderful idea, along with Wallace, of selection. First selection and then natural selection. He studied breeding, and in 1855 he took up pigeon breeding at Down House. The principle of selection is so simple. When inherited variations in a trait influence the number of offspring, the trait will change over the generations. It must change. This is not a theory. This has to happen. And when Darwin sent his grand book to Murray, Murray sent it out for referees' reports. What did the referees report? Elwyn reported, "A wild and foolish piece of imagination. At every page I was tantalized by the absence of proofs." And so Elwyn sent it to Lyell for further comment. Lyell said, "Perhaps you should focus the book on pigeons and have just a small segment about natural selection. A book on pigeons would sell so well." Darwin wrote back and said, "I think I really can't make these changes. Would it be all right if I published the book as written?" His great discovery was natural selection, and we must recognize from the start that there are two ideas here, quite separate. One is phylogeny and the unity of all life, and the other is the discovery that is equally great and often muddled up, and that is adaptation. Why traits work so well. Here we have Hawaiian honey creepers. You see that they're all descended from a common origin just 10 million years ago, and we can confirm that with genetic evidence now. But also look at their beaks. There's the short, fat beak of the one who eats stick seeds, the thin, slight beak of those who get insects from under bark, and the curved, lovely beak of that bird that gets nectar from a flower with a curved corolla. There are variations amongst these birds. Is there a pointer there handy? Maybe I'll try this one. There's the bird beak is curved in just that way because there's variation within that species of curves in that beak, and the curves that get the most nectar turned out to be the ones that are gradually made close to optimum by time. We're going to go to 3 topics today. First, I'm going to spend just one slide on how the body is so perfect, how natural selection shapes things that work. This is the main topic of adaptation studies. Then I'm going to focus the bulk of my time on why the body doesn't work very well. And then I'm going to conclude with some of my own research on evolutionary explanations for traits that seem too good to have been shaped by natural selection, in particular capacities for altruism, empathy, and moral capacities. In general, I'm not going to be talking about my own specific work on signal detection theory and depression and regulation of anxiety and evolution of moral capacities. I'll be sticking to the generalities for you today. Everyone looks at the eye as an organ of perfection, as well they should. The only clear tissue in the body, exactly where it's needed. An iris that opens and contracts just in the right way, depending on the amount of light there. The eye blink is equally sophisticated. Something comes towards your eyes and a reflex sets off the blink in an instant. And tears are more lovely than you can imagine, unless you lack tears, in which case you appreciate them desperately, coming from one side and going to the other side. And then there's a muscle that moves the eyes just right. There's a muscle that keeps the lens in focus. It's fabulous. However, it's a terribly botched design, isn't it? A terribly botched design. Imagine an engineer for Nikon cameras who decided to put the wires between the light and the film. Out, to the street, immediately. The vessels block the light, requiring a bit of nystagmus. Nearsightedness is something a third of us are plagued with. Cataracts are common in most people by a certain age. Farsightedness in all of us by the time we hit 60. Retinal detachment, glaucoma. Who designed this thing anyhow? You could design a better body. Actually, you all are too sophisticated. Your 15-year-old child could design a better body with no knowledge of biology. The first thing he or she would do is certainly eliminate wisdom teeth before the dentist took them out. The second thing would be to eliminate the appendix, so there's no need to have it taken out. The third thing is to make bones stronger, so you can do anything without breaking them. You would certainly make the immune system stronger to prevent infections. You enlarge the coronary arteries and just eliminate most heart attacks. And finally, for the women in the audience, you know what women really want. Women want a zipper so that babies can exit easily. Here we are 150 years after the origin, and the gulf between medicine and evolution is at least as large as the Grand Canyon. There are three small bridges across, established areas where evolution does contribute. Genetics, population genetics, is evolutionary medicine at its foundation. Studies of phylogeny and methods of tracing them, and studies of infection. But the gulf is huge. Just as we go by, a quick note, if there were 1 millimeter of dirt in this canyon, just about the thickness of the dirt on your kitchen floor when you don't mop it for a month, every year building up, after 1 million years, how thick would the dirt be on the floor of the Grand Canyon? It would just barely fill it to the top, after 1 million years. Now we go back 65 million years to the time of the dinosaurs. Imagine 65 kilometers of kitchen dirt on that floor. Just a little idea about the kinds of time we're talking about here. In the last 15 years, there have been new bridges built across this canyon. George Williams and I contributed the book Why We Get Sick, but there have been many others. Steve Stearns did a wonderful edited volume on evolution, health, and disease. Paul Ewald, George's earlier book, another book on evolutionary medicine. And what's wonderful is this book is in a second edition from Oxford Press last year. This book is in a second edition from Oxford Press last year. And published last week is a book by Peter Gluckman and colleagues, Principles of Evolutionary Medicine, the first textbook of evolutionary medicine. What is Darwinian or evolutionary medicine? Very simple. It's using the basic science of evolutionary biology to understand, prevent, and treat diseases. It is not radical. It has nothing to do with a method of treating patients, and it's not opposed to ordinary medicine in any way. There are four main lines of work in evolution medicine, just looking at what actually is going on. First of all, the three bridges I mentioned before, infections, studying of phylogenies, and evolutionary genetics. Those are well established, although with new vigor now, thanks to new genetic methods and new evolutionary thinking. What we're going to talk about today, however, is why selection leaves our body vulnerable, asking new questions about disease. Joseph Needham, in 1936, points out progress in science consists not so much in finding the right answers as in deciding what questions are sensible. And Jonas Salk says what people think of as the moment of discovery is really the discovery of the question. These are four people who have inspired the foundations of this field. First of all, Nico Tinbergen and his famous four questions, which there's not time to go into today. Ernst Mayr, who emphasized the difference between proximate and evolutionary explanations. John Maynard Smith, and especially my partner in all of this work, George Williams, who's been my dear friend. This would not be possible without his collaboration at all. Ernst Mayr emphasizes there are two kinds of explanation needed for everything in biology. No biological problem is solved, he says, until both the proximate and the evolutionary causation has been elucidated. Furthermore, the study of the evolutionary causes is as legitimate a part of biology as is the study of the usually physical, chemical, proximate causes. From this point of view, medical research has only been fully using one half of biology. Two kinds of questions. Proximate ones, how does the mechanism work? Two, evolutionary questions, why is the mechanism the way it is? These are separate questions, both are needed. I consider this the single most important distinction in biology, and unfortunately many of my physician colleagues have never heard of this fundamental distinction. Seeking evolutionary explanations for disease, George Williams and I began a collaboration about 20 years ago, trying to ask questions about why did selection shape this disease? Why cancer? Why heart disease? Why the appendix? Why infectious disease? After about 6 months of talking regularly about this, we decided that this was the wrong question. We finally turned ourselves around in a long conversation to realize that we'd missed something, that selection can't just explain adaptations, it can also explain maladaptations, aspects of the body that aren't very good at all. The right question is, why has natural selection left the body vulnerable to this disease? Parts of the body are so exquisite, it's very hard to believe they were shaped by natural selection. Other parts are such botched jobs that any engineer who designed them would be fired in an instant. The question is, why are some parts so good and others so bad? The old answer, the one I was taught in medical school, is that natural selection just isn't that powerful. There are mutations, Dr. Nesse. You have to quit this idea that natural selection can do anything. Well, I certainly have quit that idea, but this model of why the body doesn't work well is not correct. The new answer is that there are 6 good evolutionary reasons we should consider for each disease about why the body isn't better. First, mismatch with a modern environment. Second, competition with pathogens. Third, every trait is a trade-off. No trait can be perfect. Fourth, constraints on what natural selection can do. Fifth, natural selection does not in fact shape health. And finally, confusing defenses with diseases. I'm next going to give you 1 or 2 examples of each of these just to give you a flavor. One could go through 20 or 30 examples in each area. We begin with mismatch, the cause of most chronic disease in today's hospitals. Atherosclerosis is the exemplar, apparently less common in hunter-gatherers, although if you look, you'll find that this fundamental question for understanding atherosclerosis is inadequately answered. I don't see a great study about rates of atherosclerosis corrected for age in hunter-gatherers. But this is a frightening slide nonetheless. Most of us have this stuff in our coronary arteries. Why is that? We try to keep our cholesterol down below 200. That's what the doctors tell us to do. But when you look at people who live in a more ancestral environment, their levels range between 120 and 130, vastly lower than those of almost all of us today. This is a brave doctor who realized that Crohn's disease, a terrible autoimmune disease of the small bowel, was rare in populations where people lived with worms in their gut. He thought that this might contribute to the disease, so he began giving his patients living worms from pigs. What did he get? He got 80% remission rates in his patients by giving them live whipworm. Finally, one of my favorite examples is myopia, a problem many of us here share. I often imagine myself on the African savannah saying, "Well, hello, kitty." It would harm my fitness dramatically. I asked my professors in medical school, this seems preposterous. Heritability is 80%. You're saying it's a genetic disease. Natural selection should have eliminated it. And I was told, Dr. Nesse, natural selection can't do everything. There are mutations. Get used to it. Well, in fact, if you study this more carefully, you realize that if you don't learn to read early in life, it doesn't matter what genes you have, you're not going to get nearsightedness. This is a quirk. These are not genetic defects. Most of the genes for chronic diseases are not defects. They're quirks. They cause disease only when they interact with modern environments. 2, competition with other organisms. They evolve faster than we do. I'm amazed often that Metazoans can exist. I think we might go to Mars and find things evolve to a several cell stage and then pathogens eat them up. Penicillin resistance, from the time my children were young, when we gave a dose of penicillin for strep pneumonia and it cured them, to now almost half are resistant. You know this terrible story. But do you know what doctors say about antibiotic resistance? They call it emergence, about 10 to 1. Biologists call it evolution and natural selection 10 to 1. Doctors don't even dare use the E word. Does this matter that doctors aren't really doing an evolutionary approach? Well, some well-meaning doctors decided they were going to prevent antibiotic resistance at their hospital, so every 6 months they all agreed to start a different antibiotic as their first choice. After 6 months they changed to the next one. After 6 months they changed to the next one. Then along comes this young mathematician, biologist, Carl Bergstrom, who does an analysis of this and discovers that these doctors had come upon almost the exact optimal way of speeding the development of antibiotic resistance. It's very nice for doctors to think about evolution, but there's a lot to it. One can't just do it from one's armchair. 3, every trait is a trade-off. If your child skateboards, you probably know about Achilles fracture. You fall forward and the radius breaks right here. Why didn't natural selection make it thicker? People have been falling forward long before skateboards. The answer is this, the miracle. Look at this miracle. You can do this too. We all can do this. No robot can do this. It's fabulous. And if that radius were quite a lot thicker, we'd be going like this. We couldn't throw. We couldn't do anything. Here's one I wish I had known in medical school. Why does the body make bilirubin? I was taught that bilirubin is just a waste product from degrading hemoglobin. There's an intermediate, however, called biliverdin, which is more water soluble. Why doesn't natural selection just get rid of it then and there? Turns out that bilirubin is a very good antioxidant, something wonderful for long-lived species. So how can you test a hypothesis like this? Saul Schneider and Sedlak at Johns Hopkins decided to do a knockout model where they knocked out the gene that allowed the pathway that goes back and forth between biliverdin and bilirubin to go back and forth the way it does tens of thousands of times a second. And what happened? These cells died very quickly from oxidative damage. Next is a question that I got into as an undergraduate that led to me to my collaboration with George Williams and publications on evolution and aging. The question is, why does aging exist at all? In 1957, George Williams published a paper that said what people knew already, that some mutations accumulated because the force of selection is going to be very low at the age when almost all animals are dead in the wild. But he also noted that a gene could be selected for, even if it caused aging, if it gave benefits in youth, like, for instance, increasing the strength of your bones, even if that same gene calcified the coronary arteries. This has led to a whole world of research and has revolutionized the study of senescence and gerontology. I've applied it in many studies, but in particular, I like the one where I looked at what would happen if aging were suddenly eliminated, if the mortality rate stayed the same throughout life as it is now at age 20. About a third of us would live to age 1,000. Very nice indeed. This is why the senior members of our parliaments and Congress are so interested in giving money to certain areas of medical research. I also emphasize that this is not easy science at all. I'm giving you quick examples without adequate evidence. Some people come up with ideas without considering all of the evidence. This is a smart fellow who came up with the idea that maybe type 1 diabetes was useful and the genes were selected for during the Ice Age because high levels of glucose protect your tissues against freezing damage. Except that type 1 diabetes kills you. This is a serious problem for any such theory. In fact, this is very difficult science. However, this idea was picked up uncritically by some of the best journalists in the world, and I said to them, check this out with evolutionary biologists, this is ridiculous, don't publish this. And they came back to me and said, Dr. Nesse, we've checked with the leading 3 diabetologists in the world, and they all assure us this is a good idea. Constraints. There are things that natural selection can't do, lots of them. Just one example for you today is back to the eye. The octopus has a properly designed eye. Instead of the nerves and vessels coming through a hole in the back and spreading out between the light and the receptors, the octopus eye has the optic nerve coming back and spreading through the back of the retina, never creating a blind spot, no retinal detachment, no need for nystagmus, a better design altogether. So why is the octopus eye done right and our eye done wrong? And the answer is bad luck, just bad luck. Several hundred million years ago in the origins of this trait. Natural selection can't go back and start fresh. We wouldn't do very well being blind for about 1 million years it would take to fix this. Next, health is not selection's goal. This is one of the more disturbing aspects for me. I always thought natural selection shaped us for health, longevity, and happiness, and good, close, warm, loving relationships. Oh, what a disappointment this has been. I've studied the sex mortality ratio, that is the ratio of the percentage of men who die each year compared to the percentage of women who die each year. And my guess before I did this work was that perhaps for each 100 women in their prime who died, perhaps 120 men would die. Then I got data from the World Health Organization, analyzed it for 20 different countries, and I was astounded to see that for every 100 men who die at prime of life at age 20, 300. For every 100 women who die, 300 men die. Now, having women's health programs is wonderful, but guys, we're dying at 3 times the rate of women. Shouldn't we do something about that? Of course, if you chose as an individual to do something about this, a very small surgical procedure might, well, let's skip that. Defenses and suffering, I think, are one of the most valuable contributions evolution makes to medicine. I never quite grasped in my medical training that there were 2 different kinds of problems my patients were bringing to me. Sometimes they brought me problems coming directly from defects in the body, seizures, cancer, paralysis, jaundice, and the like. Something's just wrong in the transmission and the gears and the wiring of the body. But most of the problems people brought me were defenses. These are useful responses coordinated with response control systems that set them off when they're useful. Fever, cough, anxiety, and even low mood are all capacities which are useful if they are expressed in the right circumstance. Darwin knew this. Pain or suffering, he says, of any kind is well adapted to make a creature guard itself against any great or sudden evil. But I think a philosopher said it better, actually. I think Schopenhauer was right on the money when he says, if the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. I study panic disorder. Eventually, after studying it for 15 years, I realized it's a fight-flight response, false alarm. When this fellow is coming, how loud a noise behind a rock do you need to run? If it could be him, but it could be just a monkey. Here's the answer. If the cost of fleeing is 200 calories, and the cost of not fleeing if it's a lion is on the average 200,000 calories, then if you do a signal detection analysis using this kind of, using the mathematics, you find that any noise that indicates the probability of a lion is greater than 1 in 1,000 means you should flee. This means that 999 times out of 1,000 your flight will be unnecessary, but perfectly normal. This is the smoke detector principle, and this explains how the general practice of medicine is possible. Most general medicine does not cure disease, it relieves symptoms by using drugs to block the manifestations of normal defenses. This is possible because of the smoke detector principle, and I wish all doctors had a whole month studying the regulation of defenses, because this is what they do from day to day without understanding what they're really doing. This is the fancy mathematics you can use to calculate these things and find out what the optimum actually is. So wrapping up about the body, why isn't the body better? There are 6 good evolutionary reasons. And in fact, you mix and match them for any particular disease. With, for instance, atherosclerosis, it's partly mismatch, but it also is because the lining of the blood vessels, the endothelium, needs to be very responsive to inflammation to make sure the bacteria can't set up a foothold there. And this makes atherosclerosis development more likely. And the key is that every disease needs an evolutionary explanation. One of the great pleasures I've had in the past year is writing a chapter with Richard Dawkins for the Oxford Textbook of Medicine. Remarkably, this will be the first chapter in a major textbook of medicine saying, folks, we should be asking for each disease in this book what the evolutionary explanation is for vulnerability to this disease. So what does evolution offer medicine? Specific methods, an alternative to what I consider to be the very seriously flawed metaphor of the body as a machine, a framework for organizing 10,000 facts in the medical curriculum, and with thanks to Evelyn Fox Keller's wonderful title, I think it gives you a feeling for the organism. I had a wonderful medical education, but I never got any feeling for the organism or what disease really is. And I think that's continually developing as I work on trying to understand disease better from an evolutionary viewpoint. Do doctors learn evolution? They do not learn it as undergraduates. There is no medical school that teaches evolution in the medical curriculum. This is a serious, serious gap which must be solved. So our conclusion for evolution in medicine is very simple. Evolution is a crucial basic science for medicine that's mostly missing, and education reform is essential if we're to make full use of it. And now to my last 3 slides, just to connect this with some of my current work and make a nice transition into the talk by Sarah Hrdy. There are some traits that seem too good to be shaped by natural selection. In particular, many of us, ever since George Williams and especially Richard Dawkins, have been preoccupied with the problem of altruism and moral capacities. One of the things that I hope we'll talk about someplace in this week is that the problem of cooperation in the last 20 years has been solved. This is one of the huge advances in science in our time, and most people aren't really aware of it because those of us in the field argue about the fine points instead of recognizing that the big kahuna has been solved. Mutual benefits account for many, kin selection accounts for more, most in animals, trading favors or reciprocity in humans only, and cultural selection also accounts for moral capacities, or at least for cooperation, not so much for moral capacities. Needing more explanation, however, are 3 capacities at least. Capacity for morality, lying awake at night with that guilty feeling that you have that keeps you awake. Empathy, the pain you feel when someone close to you has a problem. And commitment to a relationship, even when there's nothing you can possibly get out of it. I've been devoting myself to this problem for years. Many other people have. And I found recently a solution, I think, to some of it. Now, as with many problems, there are many solutions that contribute. But Mary Jane West Eberhard, an insect biologist in 1979 and 1982, wrote 2 wonderful papers on runaway social selection. Here I can only give you the quickest rundown, but what she noted is that the peacock has a large tail because those with large tails are preferred as mates, and therefore they get a reproductive advantage, making the tail not only big, but bigger and bigger and bigger in a runaway process. And then in her wonderful insight, she also noted that humans who display empathy and generosity are preferred as relationship partners and as group members. And I've gone through this and expanded it more with human work and done the modeling to show that, in fact, this can shape runaway capacities for prosocial traits that I think are otherwise inexplicable. Where I end up is with where I would like to see evolution of medicine be in a few years. We have 3 bridges which are rapidly expanding, and there's a 4th bridge that needs to be built, asking evolutionary questions about disease. If we can accomplish this, I think we'll do a great deal for human health. Thank you very much.